Jamie, good morning.
Morning, mate. How you doing?
We are good. Now, you have a company called VX Sport, and you're involved with the All Blacks. You're going to be involved in cricket coverage. You're going to go, you've been in Qatar, doing all sorts of things. How hot is it in Qatar, by the way? Can they play soccer?
Mate, 43 degrees, and the worst thing about that is 75% humidity, so it's just dripping off you.
Jamie, that doesn't sound like that's conducive for football.
Your research would have suggested when playing sport in Qatar not to run around, just stand on the spot.
Mate, I'm not going down that way with FIFA. But as far as the locals, mate, are concerned, it's all go. Their plans are just incredible. Like what they're showing you is going to be built, and how they're going to be doing it is next level. They really are going to throw some money at it, and if anyone can do it, I think they can.
So your VX Sport units and the stuff that you measure for the All Blacks, for various other sports, we're not just talking sort of heart rates and speed across the ground, are we?
No, I guess it's gone a lot further than that in recent times, mate. We're sort of trying to be more specific, I guess, both positionally and then also looking at the level of intensity. And if you look at a club game compared to an All Blacks game, sometimes the distances covered aren't that different, but what is different is the distance covered at high intensity, the number of sprints that occur, and even in more recent times, the collisions. And that's really going to be a big one, I think, the next 12 months, the collisions.
Speaking with Jamie Tout from VX Sport. Now, you're going to be at a panel discussion today about how your data analysis and all the monitoring that you do can help to international rugby. Can you measure the impact of concussions and head knocks and things like that?
Yeah, it's early days in that regard. There are a few people around the world doing that, and people that we are talking to try and bring that information together. It's the different types of collisions that occur that's the most hard to detect, whether that's a tackle, whether that's in a scrum position, and those all things play a huge factor. And like if we look at across different sports, what some of those forces might look like, you might be looking at sort of 5 to 10 Gs of impact in a rugby collision, whereas in a Formula One car you're only getting 5 to 6 Gs. Now that looks really weird at the start, but what's happening in Formula One is that collision or that force is being sustained for a very long period of time, whereas a lot of what happens in rugby is happening more often, but it's happening at extremely short periods of time as well.
Now, let's stick talking rugby and the data you've achieved. Of the All Blacks, who generally delivers the biggest wow factor when it comes to, you just go, wow, this guy's doing awesome stuff?
Hit us with some stats.
Yeah, well, Nick Gill is a really good user of all this sort of type of technology, and he always sort of talks about some of the workhorses being Conrad Smiths and the Richie McCaws of the world. They sort of consistently stand up. And in more recent times, your halfbacks are really putting some pressure on those guys purely in fitness numbers. But what one stat you might be interested in is, like last year's Super Rugby just gone, we're looking at about, the athletes are ranging sort of between 150 and 165 beats per minute on average during the course of that game. Wow. The forwards are spending about 50 minutes of the 80-minute game above that average, and the backs are spending about 30 minutes of that time above that average.
Lazy.
Well, I was only going to bring out, Mr. Mulligan, a stat from you from a couple of years back, playing a celebrity soccer game where I think you were getting well over 200 beats per minute, which is probably above the norm too.
I reckon it was, I remember it was 224.
224?
Yeah, 224.
Well, if you use the adage of 220 minus your age, that's probably not a good space to be in.
He should have died, shouldn't he?
Well, your heart beats 100,000 times a day, they say. So Mr. Mulligan's was probably going a bit faster than that at different times that day. You
know what that was? That was anaerobic. That was anaerobic testing right there. You need a bit of interval training.
Now, you have data from other sports as well. And one of the ones that fascinated me was you had data on like the difference between Kelly Slater and the average surfer.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So we went out to a couple of Quicksilver events, and I think initially we went out there, they asked us to measure the speed of the surfer on the waves and how long the waves were. And that was interesting in itself. They were sort of travelling between 35 and 45 k's an hour on a wave. Most of the wavelengths were around 90 to 100 metres, but what really set Kelly Slater apart was the fact that on those waves he was achieving somewhere between 10 and 12 turns on average, whereas other surfers were somewhere between 8 and 10. And I guess that the basis to that is more turns, more opportunity to get more points, and it just shows that those athletes that are at that level, just those small instances where they can sort of change the game or change the way they accumulate points.
So you're able to come up with these little pieces of data that differentiate great from good, and then the coaches will use that.
Yeah, and I think the really important thing now is to how we integrate that data across all the different pillars of high performance. So technically, tactically, physically, how do we bring it together? Because any one number in isolation can be quite easy to misinterpret. So it's important that when we do present this data back to coaches, one, it's in a really quick format to digest and understand and make a programming decision on that. Because one of the, I guess, mottos of VX is not to create paralysis by over-analysis and just throwing numbers at people for the sake of it. So it's more about how do we use those numbers to build a better athlete.
That's my broadcasting ethos, paralysis by analysis, just throwing numbers at people. Okay, so what are you going to do with Channel 9's cricket coverage? Because the most revealing thing I've seen from them has been Doug Bollinger's rug.
Yeah, fair call. No, Channel 9's been a big supporter with what we do for a number of years, and we report back to them on heart rates and distances travelled, number of sprints, and how fast the bowlers are running in, that sort of thing. And we're working with animation research down in Dunedin to try and bring those numbers to life.
Oh, nice.
So the couple of things we worked out from the season just gone, we saw that in a test match, the average heart rate's around 120 beats. In ODI, it's closer to 140. And in T20, it's closer to 160. We saw Johnson, when he's steaming in, he can bowl 18, 20 overs in a day. He'd be travelling over 23 Ks in a day. When Ponting was at the peak of his powers, he was going out there and batting, and his average heart rate when he was batting was sitting at 150 to 160. And the interesting thing about that is he's making split-second decisions. So under fatigue, under stress, and his heart rate being that high, be able to perform and execute those skills is pretty impressive.
Have you seen the ability of, say, Richie McCaw and the way that they've used him change in any of the telemetrics you've got, or is your data on him not as expansive or as long? Yeah,
look, I haven't got anything too specific on McCaw himself, but I guess when you start looking at how the game is changing, the ball's in play for longer periods of time, they're travelling slightly more distance, but they're also covering that distance at a greater rate of knots. So guys like Nick and the other conditioners in the Super Rugby are all very conscious now of changing the way they're conditioning their athletes to make sure they're getting that volume of high-intensity sprinting into their sessions and covering the amount of distance they need to at high intensity. Like football players, we'll give you as an example, they probably spend about 15% of their total distance covered running at high speeds, whereas league and rugby is probably slightly under 10%. They have to do that. That's the nature of their game. But then you throw on top of that the average football player also weighs about 20 kilos less than a rugby player. So there's a lot of, like I say, one number in isolation doesn't mean a lot, but when you start looking at these numbers together, we can start seeing some pretty good patterns for how we condition them.
Bloody interesting, Jamie. We've got to let you go, but thank you very much for your time today.
No, pleasure, mate. And just let Mr. Maybe know that he is ready to referee his game tomorrow night. He's got a great yo-yo result this year, 18.6, mate. So
Ooh!